Hope that we can answer some of your questions, hope that I can answer some of your questions, and we might have a little guest star sort of hopping in here in a little bit. So, yeah. So welcome. And like I said, please type in any questions that you have that you want me to answer. What I like to do, I guess I'll go ahead and just get started. What I like to do with some of this is I like to sort of answer the questions that you have about the topic at hand, which is the Renaissance, and maybe things that you don't understand or things that you're having difficulty with. And I can try and explain them as best I can and hopefully help you understand the big picture and what was going on, and put everything into perspective so that you can do better in your class and whatnot. So helps if I get people who ask questions. You can go ahead and you can put them into the chat window here, and ask questions as you want. All right, so first question comes in: will we be able to see this video after its completion? Yes. I think actually if you keep the same link that it'll be available, but certainly if you go to my YouTube channel, then you can you'll find the video sitting there, and you can watch the entire stream and get all the information hopefully that you want. Now, I don't know where you guys are in terms of the school year. Just to tell you a little bit about how we're approaching it this year. We're in our third week of school already, so we've gone through the Middle Ages and we're finishing up the Renaissance and testing on the Renaissance on Thursday. So I don't know if you guys are ahead of my students or if you're behind my students in terms of timing, but yeah, the Renaissance is kind of where we are, and so that's what I'm going with. I guess I can start off just by saying the big focus that I have when I try and do these, especially since the whole setup of the AP exam has changed, is to really kind of focus on what it is that the College Board really wants you to know. And it is good in some ways and is troublesome in others. The nice thing is they've really kind of laid out exactly what it is that they want you to know. And so therefore we can narrow down a lot of the information. There's a lot of information that you might find in textbooks that is not essential to exactly what it is that could be tested. And so I'm trying to take kind of the pragmatic approach of like, if it's not going to be tested, then maybe we don't need to worry about it quite as much as if it were being tested. Not to say that there aren't great stories out there, and not to say that there aren't great everything out there, but you kind of measure yourself. All right, so the role of women in society during the Renaissance. Well, the role of women really depended on kind of the social class that you were in. The opening of learning certainly spread education, but the traditional ways, the traditional roles of women were still wife, mother, sort of head of the household, all of that kind of thing. As you moved up in the social ranks, when you get into the aristocracy and into the kings, queens, that kind of thing, obviously things shift quite a bit. But women were often used almost as political capital in terms of moving the family's social status up, or well, hopefully up, not down, I guess. In other words, if someone had two daughters, then he was maybe like a fairly wealthy businessman. He could offer them up for marriage with dowries. They could marry into noble families, and then the whole family's status would move up. Certainly inside of Italy is a good example. In the Italian city-states, they could move up, and they could gain more status and more wealth and things like that. There are a few women who stand out as sort of like educated intellectuals, but for the most part, women's roles are fairly limited, and for the most part, they don't have a whole lot of rights and things like that. Their role is really kind of in the home for the most part. Eli is on. Good. Could you talk a little bit about why it became important for children to learn trades so young? Well, Eli, it's really, you really kind of have to go back and just understand the whole situation back then. Children learned trades when they were young because what else are you going to do with the children? There's no formal education system that's really available outside of the extreme aristocracy. And the traditional elites are not even really into the education thing, anyway. And so when a child got past the point where, they were just kind of running around and playing, they were sent out to learn how to do something. And the quicker they learned how to do it, the more years they spent young learning how to be an apprentice and learning how to, I don't know, paint or be a blacksmith or, whatever it may be, then the more likely it was that they were going to be able to make a living. And they would make that living by going through this process where they were an apprentice, and then they were a journeyman who would go around and work, sort of for other people and, sort of traveling around, and then hopefully become a master and a member of a guild, which is sort of a group of people who, a group of artisans who ran kind of the same trade inside of a city state. And when you're part of that guild, then you're sort of like, you give the stamp of approval and you can run your own shop and all of that. So that's why it was important to sort of get them going. And again, like there wasn't really much else for them to do other than work, because there was no, sort of major educational system like we think about today. Spicy Nacho here, I like it, wants to know, what would you need to know about Jan van Eyck and Rembrandt, or Mannerism and Baroque styles? Okay, so the Mannerism and Baroque styles really get outside of the Renaissance, but what the AP guys really want you to understand is that art is not just a reflection of society, but it's also a tool of society. And this applies to Renaissance art as well. So you can have people who are in power who want to show off their power by, being patrons of the arts. And depending on who it is that's your patron, you're going to create, as an artist, things for them. The Renaissance painters really got a lot of patronage from commercial elites in the Italian city-states, like the Medicis and whatnot. In the High Renaissance, a lot of it came through the church, again with the Medicis and whatnot, who were running it at the time, but other people as well. And so creating things that beautified cities and churches and all of that. In the Northern Renaissance, it tends to be more artisans and businessmen and stuff like that. And so when you look at guys like Jan van Eyck and Rembrandt, and you sort of, Jan van Eyck is like Northern Renaissance. It's really sort of trying to portray a more natural, a more realistic view of the world. It's trying to show perhaps classes of people that weren't being shown by Renaissance artists in Italy. Normal people that are sort of out having a festival or something like that would be considered a good natural thing. Rembrandt is a Baroque artist, and Baroque, along with Mannerism, is all about like sort of creating this emotional awe, like make this thing so incredibly wow that like, yeah, it just kind of grabs your attention. And Rembrandt, is a master, and they use different techniques of light and shadow to create an emotional attachment to all of this. So Baroque is like used by churches and kings, and all of this becomes very big in like during the absolutist period. Is really when that comes around. Mannerism is kind of a reaction to the Renaissance, in that you have these people who are learning from Renaissance masters, and the Renaissance masters who'd gone out and like almost perfected sort of the human style perfected the human body and how to portray it and all of that. Like, how do you improve on that? And so they improve on it by exaggerating it. And so Mannerists you can always pick out because you have these really sort of elongated figures. You have these people with like really long fingers or really long necks or stuff like that. And you sort of grab it right off the bat for that. So that's what you really need to know, is not only like the emotional side of it and the attempt to portray, especially with Jan van Eyck, a more natural state of being, but also you want to understand that these elites are using this to show off their power and their wealth, whether it's businessmen or whether it's kings and princes and people like that. So they patronize the art. Ash is asking, would you consider the Renaissance to be a rebirth for women, or was it only for high-class men? It's a really, really general question. I would say if I was to choose, I would say that probably the rebirth was much more for higher class men. That women having a rebirth in the Renaissance was a fairly was an exception rather than the rule. But with it's really the educated men who are really getting into the Renaissance. It's humanist scholars. It's people who are being educated in order to sort of take that civic humanist approach to try and improve their city-states or their country's status through learning and through the patronage of the arts. It's the wealthy who are coming along, and they're surrounding themselves with all of this new learning, these new ideas, and all of that. Women are participating at a much lesser extent, and I think when you look at sort of the course, sort of all European history from what we call the early modern period, which is like the Renaissance and whatnot, all the way up until the modern day, you can almost trace a general line of progression whereby women in the early part of this period have very few rights and have very like little involvement in sort of, I hate to say this, but like society in the sense that people would write about it a lot. Their sphere is more in the home, and then there's sort of a gradual increase of rights and an increase in participation in social life outside the home, so that you see that today, while I admit that things are not exactly equal between men and women, it's really close between men and women. So there's, this is sort of the start of it. And you have a few women who are starting to break out and a few women who are starting to dabble in different things. But for the most part, yeah, it's all about guys at this point. The significance, Michael Yu, for the humanism during the Renaissance. The significance of humanism is like key to the entire thing. Understanding humanism is understanding the Renaissance, because, okay, take this like for the whole year. Europeans, and by extension, I think Americans as well, as sort of the children, what's the word I'm looking for? All right, fine. The children of Europe, as a society, like we look for big ideas, and then we try and enact those ideas into real life situations. And that's sort of the progression. You need kind of a big goal to go for. And humanism is the big goal. Humanism, in its simplest terms, is this revival of interest in the Greek and Latin world, sort of like the ancient classical world. Had largely been ignored during the Middle Ages, because the Middle Ages were concerned with two things: security and security from invasion and all that, and Christianity, which was really the Roman Catholic Church. And with humanism, you start to see people who are rediscovering these ancient works that are written by pagan writers. And one of the things that they have to overcome is they have to look and say, how can we value the ideas of these people who, according to Christianity and according to the church, were pagans and are now in hell. And they sort of made that jump by coming along and saying, well, they were good people, and besides, they lived before Christ, so they didn't really have a chance to be Christian. And so now we can go and we can read about them. Well, and then ancient Greek and Latin texts start talking about the value of the individual. They talk about making life on earth better, whether it's for yourself or whether it's for the people around you or your society or things like that. Learning for the sake of learning, all of that. And so humanism encompasses all of that. It's trying to value the individual as a person on earth who lives his life not just for salvation in heaven, but also for making his life better on earth, and that's okay. And here are these writers who are saying that. Of course, Christian writers that had been studied throughout the Middle Ages were more about salvation, living a life that would get you into heaven, and those sorts of things. So humanism is super key for understanding what's going on during the Renaissance. Michael, you also asked, how is Machiavelli still important today? Well, interestingly enough, I actually gave my students today an article that was in Forbes magazine, I think last year, and it was basically, what is Machiavelli's role today? And Machiavelli's role is very simply this: that Machiavelli has a lot of insight into human behavior. He understood in many ways, how people behave, and he's oversimplified in a lot of classes and a lot of places by saying, everyone grabs onto that whole, it's better to be feared than loved, and so he's sort of taken on by dictators and people like that, and fear, right? But the message is a lot deeper than that. The message basically says of Machiavelli is that people are generally fickle, as he calls them. In other words, if times are good, they're going to be pretty happy with you, and if you rely on sort of winning them over and making them love you and all of that, well, it's great. But when things start to go bad, then if they just love you, then they're going to turn on you. And he admits that it's better to be loved and feared at the same time. But if you have to choose one, fear's better. Because when those times get bad, if people fear you, they're not going to turn on you quite as quickly, And yet, he also says, there's a difference between creating fear, which is productive, and being cruel and sort of like overusing your power, which turns people away from fearing you and into hating you, which is not where you want to go. So, I mean, his ideas on power are still read by all major political figures today, because they still have a lot of vibrance, and they still have a lot of reality, and they have a reality for the everyday life, power relations between you and your teacher, for example, are governed by Machiavelli. You have Machiavellian teachers who tend to sort of rule by fear, and you can understand that, and you can understand why when you read what he has to say. I have a question about elaborating on the Avignon papacy. So confused about how it inspired an anti-papal sentiment. Okay, the Avignon papacy is a very, very complicated story. So here's sort of like the Cliff Notes version of what's called the Great Schism. So it's time to elect a pope. And what traditionally happens in the Catholic Church is that when it's time to elect a pope, the cardinals of the church come together in Rome, and they go into the Sistine Chapel, and they discuss who should be the next pope, and they wait for sort of the hand of God to guide their discussions, and they hold votes, and when they agree upon a pope, then you have a new pope, and it goes on. Well, there was a pope that was elected who was a non-Italian pope, and he decided to move the pope move the papacy. And I'm not going to worry about names because, quite honestly, the Pope names throw me. But anyway, he decided, being French, that he would rather move, to the south of France and, live, a nice life there, or what is now France. So he establishes a new papacy at Avignon. He builds this, it has this large, like complex built. There's a lot of somewhat shady things that go on inside of there, but yeah, I mean, it's collecting a lot of wealth. There's then another papal election, and during that election, when everybody comes back to Rome to elect them, the people of Rome, who really, like, they have no trade in Rome, they have no like businesses going on in Rome, their entire business revolves around the church. And when the church left, I mean, the city really went bad. So as the cardinals are sitting there debating who should be the next pope, you have this kind of like, I don't know, Roman mob that kind of is congregating outside and, threatening and stuff like that. And so bada bing, bada bang, you have a vote, and there's an Italian pope. Yes. And so the Italian pope is made the new pope. But the French cardinals leave, and they leave Rome to what they consider safety, and then they say the vote was not really guided by God, but it was guided by the Roman mob. So they have their own vote, and they elect a new pope who's French, and he moves into Avignon. So now you have two popes. Both of them are saying that they are the rightful pope and the rightful heir to the papacy and St. Peter and all of that. The other guy is actually sort of like an agent of Satan, an anti-pope, part of the antichrist. And to follow him is, pathway to hell. This is made worse by the 100 Years' War because France and her allies tend to back the French Pope, and England and her allies tend to back the Italian Pope. And so a council comes together and they decide, how about this? We'll get rid of both of those popes. We'll elect a new pope, and then it'll all be over. So they do that, and they issue to these two popes. They say, you've got to step down, and we've got ourselves a new pope. Well, both of them decide not to step down, and now there are three popes. Now, the reason that it sort of undermines papal sentiment is because if you're a person living at the time who's living for salvation and living to get into heaven, and the path to heaven is what the church tells you, who do you follow? I mean, you got three popes out there at this point, and they're all saying that each other are agents of the devil. And if you follow them, you're going to hell. If you follow the right one, then you're going to heaven. And yikes, right? It ain't good. And so anyway, they eventually pull together in a thing called the Council of Constance, and they make all kinds of offers to all three popes. They promise them all kinds of, nice burial sites and, money and all of this. And all three popes decide to step down, and they elect another pope, and that kind of ends it all. But throughout that process, people kind of get a little soured on sort of the papacy. Mabel, can you please make these videos weekly? They're so helpful. Well, to be honest with you, the reason that I'm doing this is because I coach cross country, and I'm not able to really tutor my students after school because I'm off running around with middle school kids on trails and hills and all that good stuff. So the plan is to kind of, at least for a while, do this on at least a weekly basis so that people can do it. So yes, stay tuned, Mabel. This is probably going to be a fairly regular thing. However, if you haven't checked them out, you can certainly go to my YouTube page, which you're probably on right now, and you can see that I've created a number of AP Euro videos, and I'll be creating more, and they cover a lot of this material. So all of that is there as well. Austin asks, can you help me out with this? How did the spread of the Renaissance ideals contribute to the development of national culture? Okay, so nationalism, national culture is sort of like this feeling of a common bind with other people. And that bind tends to be on a national level. It's not kind of, as we think about it, a lot of like borders, but at the time it's more about a common heritage, a common language, a common culture with maybe common foods, you know, all of those sort of cultural things. And this commonality of like, we're this and other people are this. And language is a big part of that. So as learning became more accepted and it became more embraced, and as more and more people became educated, they started to go and write more and more things. The printing press really helped this out because they could not only write it, but they didn't have to like handwrite everything and handwrite every copy and all of that. So it became much cheaper and much faster and much easier to send all this stuff out. Well, everything had been written in Latin, and you increasingly have people who start to write things in vernacular languages. Oh my gosh, vocab term, vernacular. That's like the language people speak, okay? So you have people who are writing in vernacular Italian, for example. And as they write books, treatises, pamphlets, whatever, in this Italian, they have to choose a dialect of what is Italian. And there's, you know, lots and lots of different dialects out there that are going on. And they're very different. I mean, sometimes you have people who from, like, we think of a nation, but they can barely understand one another. They're speaking the same language, but, you know, it's different forms. And when you have people who go and put things in the vernacular, it establishes the language or the form of the language, the dialect of the language, into like the language. So when Dante writes the Inferno, you know, I think I'm right on that one. It establishes sort of like the Italian that that Dante wrote in, it's kind of a Florentine Italian. When Martin Luther translated the New Testament into German, his version of German became like German, and it was the accepted German. And you have that occurring all over the continent as people do this. And so as you have a language and more books, treatises, whatever are being written in that language, it creates this national culture because you can read stuff in your language. And let's face it, if you want to sell books, because now you have the ability to really sell books, because more people are becoming educated and there's a printing press, you're going to write things that people will want to read. And what better to write down than things like folk tales and whatnot, that or stories that relate to your national culture. And boom, you've got sort of this. It's not a direct line, but it certainly helps develop that. Spicy Nacho is back. The differences between the Renaissance and the Northern Renaissance. All right. Well, the biggest difference, the Northern Renaissance is also known as the Christian Renaissance. And I think that's like really, like from a Northern Renaissance perspective, you get the idea of the geography of it all. When you look at the Christian Renaissance, which it's also called, then you get the idea of the subject matter of it. In the Italian Renaissance, you have these writers who are looking back at ancient Greek and Roman texts, and they're translating them in order to gain a better perspective on how to, you know, maybe live their lives and improve their lives and things like that. The Northern Renaissance, or the Christian Renaissance thinkers, increasingly are looking at translating Christian texts, that being the Bible, that being the writings of ancient, or not ancient, but, you know, early Christian writers, and translating those out of Latin and into, you know, either a more modern Latin or into a vernacular language. A great example of this is Erasmus, who goes and translates the New Testament. And he goes through, and being a scholar of ancient Greek, using the same methods of the Italian humanists, he goes back and tries to translate, you know, from, you know, as original manuscripts as he possibly can. And what he finds out, or what at least the conclusion he comes to, because I'm never going to say that anybody's 100% right on any of this stuff, is that the Vulgate version of the Bible, Vulgate, V-U-L-G-A-T. This is the accepted version of the Bible, which is the Latin translation written by Pope Gregory, I believe. Anyway, the Vulgate Bible was like the Bible of the church, and he went through, and when he retranslated the Bible based on more original sources, he found that, at least in his opinion, some of the words had been translated incorrectly. And so he translated them in what he believed was the correct way. And, you know, sometimes when you change a word here and a word there, it changes the meaning of Bible passages and changes the meaning of what the Bible's trying to tell you. And so, like, Northern Christian Renaissance or Northern Christian humanists are really focused more on the Christian aspect of it and less on the Greek and Latin text aspect of it. So yeah, I kind of hope that that helps there. When you're talking about art, I think you can always tell, or I think you can often tell, the difference between Italian and Northern Renaissance art. Well, largely because of, usually when you have a piece of art, it'll tell you where it's made, and or at least it'll give you the artist's name. And the artist's name will typically either sound Dutch or it'll sound Italian. There's some exceptions, right? But if it sounds Italian, if it's one of the Ninja Turtles or whatnot, like Italian Renaissance. If it's Van Eyck or Bruegel or someone like that, like, these are not Italian names. These are sort of Dutch names. And the Dutch perfect the use of oils. And so the level of detail that they're able to put into their paintings is far more intense than what the Italian Renaissance painters are able to pull off, at least in my opinion. And you know, if you sort of just pull up on Google some Northern Renaissance painters, you're going to see, like, there's some intense detail here that's just, I mean, mind-blowing. You can almost pull the things right off the page. And you know, until you get to guys like Hieronymus Bosch, who's just a lunatic. I'm serious. If you want to have fun, spend an hour looking at a Hieronymus Bosch painting, because it's all about, you know, all kinds of crazy stuff. All right, perspective and symmetry of high Renaissance art is the next question. Let me just take a little sip here. All right, perspective. So Renaissance artists wanted to really perfect the way that they're portraying reality. They want to make it look real. During the Middle Ages, paintings were not based on a human reality or like a perspective reality. They were kind of based on a like a hierarchical reality, in that if you were a more important figure of the Renaissance, or of the like, if you were a saint or Mary, you're going to be bigger. If you were a contributor, then you're going to be smaller. Sorry, I just lost my feed here. Oh, there we go. Okay. So where was I? I was looking at symmetry and perspective. Right. So, so part of this had to do with perspective. And so the Renaissance artists started to play with sort of making things look more real by understanding that things are farther away, that they're going to look smaller, you know, and how does that work? And they really kind of go with sort of the like focus point, the perspective, where it's sort of like there's a vanishing point and everything goes that way. And you can see paintings where, like, all of the buildings, the lines on the buildings kind of go towards the middle, and they focus in on the central figure of the painting. And so they work with this perspective, and it makes things look a little bit more three-dimensional on a two-dimensional space. That's what it is. They also play around with sort of how to order figures, and geometry plays into it. They find that if you put three figures and you have them sort of in a triangle situation, a lot of the Madonnas are done this way. Like you have the Virgin Mary, and then you have, sort of Jesus here, and you have John the Baptist here, and it forms this triangular thing that it's more visually appealing, and that it's more soothing, I guess, and it's just a better designed painting, and so they start playing around with that. Do you believe that there were multiple rebirths or just one major rebirth? I think that's the next question. Yeah. It's an interesting question. I don't know that there's a great answer to that one. There's probably multiple, simply because you had so many people who were doing so many things. They were done over a long period of time. I mean, if you look at the early Renaissance starting in the 15th century, and then, I mean, you can trace the literary Renaissance to Shakespeare. It's probably multiple. I mean, there's not like one moment where all of a sudden, boom, like, oh my gosh, we're in the Renaissance. How cool is this? That just doesn't happen. So, you have kind of a lot of people who are contributing lots of things. They're building off one another. We like to focus on the major figures as we look at this, just to, again, simplify the story, and make it something that's digestible for all of us. There are certainly Renaissance art historians who will go through and spend their entire scholarly lives studying Renaissance art and all of the different contributions of every single Renaissance painter that they can get their hands on. And they probably would be able to give you a much more nuanced answer than this, but I would say multiple Renaissances are going on here. Some of the important people that influenced the Renaissance, I think really the people that the big names are the ones that you're going to want to know when you're talking about Renaissance sort of like thought. Petrarch is big. Castiglione is big. Mirandola is big. Della Mirandola. When you're talking about art, Raphael, Michelangelo, Jan van Eyck in the Northern Renaissance, Peter Bruegel. All of those guys are going to be sort of like your big things. You want to know family names like the Medicis, and those are like the big ones. Erasmus and Thomas More in Northern Renaissance writing. Those are the big names. If you go to my website, and I'm going to say this over and over, the College Board has put out exactly what it is that you're going to be tested on. So I put that right on my website. And so if you go to my website and you go to the concept outline, you can go and you can look, and like the names of the people that you absolutely need to know are there. Or you can just go to the Renaissance page on my website and you can click on the study guide that I made for my students. And I've listed, like, here are the names that they say you need to know. And here are names that they say would be good examples for you to have kind of in your back pocket in case you need them. And you can use those as you go along. Who was Dante? My goodness, I'm getting overwhelmed by questions here. Okay. Who was Dante and what was the Divine Comedy? Dante was a Florentine writer. He writes the Divine Comedy, which is 3 books which sort of investigate the nature of heaven and hell and all of that. He sort of pushes the Italian vernacular language. And that's kind of the big Dante thing. To be honest with you, I've tried to read the Divine Comedy and I've never gotten really far. But that's just, I guess I get distracted. Could you explain civic humanism and its relation to secularism? Well, okay, so secularism is this idea that it's okay to do stuff that's outside of the church. It's not saying, and this is a real big misconception, do not think that Italian Renaissance people, thinkers, artists, whatever, are not religious. They are big time Catholics, all right? Or, they're Christians, which was, I mean, when the Roman Catholic Church was really the only church in Western Europe. The Eastern Orthodox Church is hanging off in the East, but we're not going to get to that story yet. But there's like one church, so they're Christians, and they believe in everything the church says, and they're going to go out there, and they're just looking to kind of, work within that within that perspective. Secularism is the idea that it is okay to learn things for the sake of learning them, not for the sake of getting into heaven. And that might be the study of Greek as a language, or ancient Latin as a language, or rhetoric as a way to influence people in your city-state, or studying literature, studying art, or those sorts of things. So that's like secularism. And then civic humanism is the idea that you should take these things that you learn, all of these what we call the humanities, and use them to make your society better. So you give back. You use classical ideals to build better buildings. You use secular ideas of personal improvement to make money, so that then you can so then you can hire people to make art to make your city more beautiful. You can donate to the school and make that better. So civic humanism is about making your own society better through learning of these humanist ideals. Unfortunately, Carmina, you took the test last week, but sometimes, these things come back around. So I hope you're still there with me. What methods did the new monarchs like England and Spain use to overcome hindrances to their royal power? Austin, like the big struggle with the new monarchs is between the nobility who've held power throughout the Middle Ages and these new monarchs. And they got to take power away. The way that they're able to do this is that there's this rising group of commercial elites, like people who are making a lot of money in banking, trading, stuff like that, and they have cash. And most of the time, they're richer than the nobility, which is born into wealth, but all their wealth is kind of in land and rents and stuff like that. But these people who are selling stuff and trading stuff are just bringing in lots of cash. And so what the kings and queens are able to do is that they're able to sort of marginalize the nobility and use the wealth of the commercial elites in order to gain more power. This is also helped out by the fact that they no longer really need the nobility as a fighting force. That's their traditional Middle Ages role in this three estate system of the Middle Ages. You have those who pray, the church, those who fight, the nobility, and then those who work, which is like everybody else. And as long as your fighting force depends on wealthy people who need to spend a lot of money on armor and horses, and they need to train for years and years and years and years in order to be able to fight a pitched battle, and they joust and all that, all of the Middle Ages stuff, right? As long as it's based on that, you can't do anything without them, because you can't get rid of them, because they have all of the military power. Well, along come new things like the invention of the English longbow, the cannon, these sorts of things. And they change the ability, the use of a pike to be able to stop charging horses. All of a sudden, anyone can become a soldier. And as soon as anyone can become a soldier with very little training, at least relatively little training, then the nobility loses like their trump card, which is their ability to be the fighting force for the state. And when they do that, then these monarchs can sort of consolidate control, and they create this modern nation state. So it's not a city state, a sort of an entity based around a city like Florence. Now it's a nation state built around something like France, and they're bigger, they're wealthier, they have a lot more capability, and they are going to end up taking away the power, and they're going to be the centers of power for a very, very, very long time. How did new theories of government affect the relationship between the governing classes and the governed? To be honest with you, it really depended on where you were. For the most part, it didn't change too much. The peasants don't get a whole lot out of the Renaissance. I mean, their real changes and their real advancements are not going to come until well after the Industrial Revolution, I would say, is probably where we're going to start talking about that. But when you're talking about some of the governed, like the commercial elites in towns, well, then this is what I've just been talking about. That's changed by the simple fact that they have money. Sometimes they misuse this money, by the way, because kings are kind of tough to deal with. And so, you have a lot of kings who take out, like Ferdinand of Aragon, takes out huge loans, right? And he takes them out from, I believe it was the Medici Bank. Huge, huge, huge loans, owes them lots and lots and lots of money to the point where he can't pay them. And so he simply says, you know what? I'm not going to pay you back. Now, if you're the Medici, what do you do? Like, you can't come back and what are you going to do? You don't have an army. You can't invade France, and he has so they just renege on the loans. And sometimes banks go completely belly up because monarchs just say, no, I'm not paying you. All right. What do we need to know for Botticelli? I honestly don't think Botticelli's in the entire concept outline. But I'm just double checking just to make sure here. But if you do need to know anything about Botticelli, yeah, seriously, according to the curriculum outline that the College Board has, Botticelli, you need to know nothing about, which is really too bad because he makes a great painting. His most famous painting is The Birth of Venus, with Venus coming out of this clamshell and being born. Beautiful, beautiful painting. If you're ever in Florence, you go to, where is it? It's the Academia, I believe. But it's the art museum there. Breathtaking. But he's not in this course, like he's been taken out. So, but he's another example of sort of taking classical ideals. He's painting not religious subjects, at least not in The Birth of Venus. He's painting mythological subjects from classical civilization. Virtue in Renaissance perspective is this idea of sort of a goodness. Not a goodness in a Christian sense. It's the idea that people should live a good life, not necessarily a Christian life that follows Scripture, but that you live a good life that's virtuous. And it's the difference between that and a Christian life. While there's a lot of overlap, virtue is taken from classical writers and their idea of what makes a good person versus biblical ideas, which are talked about, of what makes a good person. So that's really the thing. Virtue is like central to humanists. That's what they're pushing for, is we want people who are good people. That's who we want running our societies. That's who we want being educated. That's who we want in positions of power. And we really want to push this idea of virtue. Yeah. I am searching, is asking all kinds of questions. Lorenzo Valla. Okay, so he's Lorenzo Valla. This guy, I love this story. So he's another humanist in Italy. And he becomes, over time, sort of the foremost authority on Latin language. He spends a lot of time looking at ancient texts and kind of like figuring how Latin evolved over the centuries from, classical Latin in like, maybe uh, the 1st and 2nd century BC, all the way up through medieval Latin and the Latin that was being used in writings and in the church at the time of the Renaissance. And he sees kind of this development. He looks back with most humanists, they kind of romanticize, and it's really a term for the 19th century, but we'll go ahead and use it. They kind of romanticize the Latin of the 1st and 2nd century BC, when you have a republic in Rome, and people are really into rhetoric and all of that, and like that's the perfect Latin, they think. But he goes through and then he applies his understanding of Latin to sort of look at a bunch of documents. And so one of the documents he looks at is called the Donation of Constantine. And according to church records, Constantine, who was sort of the first Christian Roman emperor, although a lot of people say that he was never actually a Christian himself, but he sort of brought Christianity together. He made it the official religion of Rome. Anyway, church records had it that he gave a huge tract of land to the Catholic Church. He gave it to him, and there was a document, the Donation of Constantine. He donated all this land, right? So Lorenzo Valla goes back and he looks at it and he reads it and he realizes a couple of things. Number one, the Latin, the way that the language was being used in the document was not the way that people wrote Latin in the 400s, which is when this whole thing would have happened. It was really language, a Latin that was used quite a bit later. And he noticed that there were terms that described social situations that didn't exist in the 400s, like feudalism and serfdom and things like that. And the idea of having a fief, where there was a lord that sort of ruled over a small area. Those are all being used in the Donation of Constantine, but they didn't exist in the 400s because there was no need for them. There was a Roman Empire that controlled everything, and you didn't have this decentralized power of the Middle Ages. And so he called him out. He was like, "This is a fraud. Like, this was written at some point much later." And yeah, Constantine had nothing to do with it. So the church wasn't too happy about that. But the one consolation they had is it was all being written in Latin anyway, and most people couldn't read or write. And those people who were reading and writing in Latin were doing it from a scholarly perspective. And so it didn't pose much of a threat because no one was really trying to like overthrow the church. They were just, raising these sort of academic questions and looking at things from an academic standpoint, which is what he was doing. And yeah, so interesting story there. How did the growth of cities and commerce lead to changes in social structure? Largely, the biggest change that you have is that you have the introduction of a money economy, and the people who have the money are increasingly in the towns and cities, and they don't fit into the traditional Middle Ages, the medieval social structure, which was like the three estates. You have those who pray, those who work, and those who fight. I always do them in different order, by the way. And like those who trade and make a whole lot of money don't fit. They're not peasants by any stretch of the imagination, unless you're looking solely at birth. And they don't pray. I mean, they pray, but that's like not their job. And they certainly don't fight. They just make money. And you have these people who are far, in many cases, quite a bit wealthier than the actual nobility, but they're not noble. So that throws off the whole social dynamic. And you get this really weird thing where nobles in countries and in city states and stuff like that, they start passing laws about what like the nobility can do and other people can't do. They'll pass laws about colors that you can only wear if you're of noble birth. It doesn't matter how wealthy you are, but you can only wear them if you have noble birth. And yet they realize that like they can't live without these rich traders because they want all the things that the rich traders have. You no longer want the blacksmith who's living in your castle to make your armor, when you can have finely made and decorated Italian armor brought in from a trader if you can get the money to pay them for it. And so it messes with all kinds of stuff. So let's see. Greco-Roman is just Roman and Greek. You guys got that. The book Utopia by Thomas More. Okay, so this is a northern humanist writer, Thomas More. He's really entangled with the whole Henry VIII story, and I won't get into all of that. He does write a book called Utopia, and we've heard of, I mean, it sort of like gives us the term utopia. It's the perfect place. And this is where timelines get a little mixed up, and so the overlap is a little bit, like you got to kind of go with it. But the idea is that he's telling the story of this island nation, which his characters had heard from a guy existed, on a sort of like on the way to the Americas, or the New World, as it was called. And in this perfect society, there was no conflict, and they had kind of worked everything out. And the key to all of it, well, there are really two keys. Number one is there's the elimination of any like private property and signs of wealth. All of the things that create greed in Europe at the time were marginalized in this society. For example, gold is a great example, and gold, which is very powerful and very valuable in Europe. Well, in his Utopia, like, it doesn't have any value whatsoever. It's being used as handcuffs and stuff like that. And so therefore, like, that takes away a lot of the problem. So he writes this as like, this is the perfect society. Ladies and gentlemen, we have ourselves a guest star. I was hoping this would happen. I was hoping you'd make it. Ladies and gentlemen, Tom Ritchie is here with us. Good to see you.
Oh, you too, Paul. Well, God, Glory, and Gold, and Renaissance, Northern Humanism. Sounds good.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So yeah, we were just talking about Thomas More's Utopia, and how sort of the ideas behind it that were coming up. Well, while I've got you on, you want to take a question about the printing press and what its role was in the Renaissance, and maybe introduce yourself first, just in case there's anyone on here that isn't familiar with you, which I kind of doubt.
Okay. And you said this is mostly, is this your channel or your own students, or who's our audience here?
This is my channel. It's, I don't know. I've only got like one question.
All right. Well, yeah, I'm Tom Ritchie, also on YouTube. Paul, want to compliment the lower third that you've got there going with the logo and all of that. Looks great. Let's see. Oh, my camera's off. Let's see. All right. Am I back?
Yeah, you're back.
Okay, sorry, my phone went. Yeah, sorry, I'm just kind of roughing it here on my phone. But yeah, Tom Ritchie, I've got a YouTube channel. Nice lower third you've got there, Paul, with the logo and all that. Looks great. As far as the question, what was the question again? I'm sorry.
The role of the printing press.
Yeah, the printing press. Okay, so the printing press. Now, of course, during the Middle Ages and every time before, they had to handwrite everything. Which, when we think about a manuscript, if somebody says, give me a manuscript, a lot of times we think about something that's typed, kind of a draft or something. But a manuscript really means to write by hand, just like manufacturing, when we get to the Industrial Revolution, means to make something by hand, even though we don't really talk about it like that anyway. So the printing press really kind of revolutionized communication in the same way the Industrial Revolution will revolutionize production. Now books can be mass produced. Petrarch was very upset at these monks in the Middle Ages who let these ancient texts, like, they're thinking, okay, well, I can only copy only about a fourth of Livy's books in whole, you know, and the other ones will summarize. Well, Petrarch, you know, was irate, but the thing is, you know, they were doing about all they could. They had to pray once in a while and all of that. But now ideas can get out there. So the Renaissance, humanists are able to communicate with each other. Thomas More, who Paul was just talking about, is able to communicate with Italian humanists and share, you know, his ideas about humanism. Erasmus was able to, you know, print out, you know, various things like a Greek New Testament. And I mean, it just puts an exponential effect on that. And this will also affect the Reformation and the scientific revolution, because Protestant reformers, you know, if Martin Luther had been around a century before, Martin Luther probably would have been burned at the stake, like Jan Hus and all kinds of other people who challenged the church in a similar way that he did. And then you take a look at, you know, during the scientific revolution, with all of the, you know, just somebody discovers something in Italy, you know, Copernicus, and then, you know, Copernicus is in Poland, then Galileo is in Italy, and then you've got, you know, Newton's able to see these things, and all of these things can build on each other. You know, it's kind of like, you know, somebody asked me, you know, you need to make a video on Italian unification. And I said, well, that's not really a priority for me right now, because Paul Sargent's got a perfectly good video on Italian unification, you know? And so it's one of those things that we don't have to do everything ourselves anymore. We can communicate. And the printing press is, you know, in a lot of ways, kind of what this whole YouTube thing is now. You know, it's like Paul and I can communicate, y'all can communicate. You're not limited by the resources that are available at your own school. So, you know, really the printing press did for the world at that time, in a lot of ways, what the internet is doing for the world now.
Yeah, and I think that's an important distinction to make, is that you do kind of have this printing press being part of a continuum, you know, where communication becomes more prevalent, easier as time goes on, from the printing press to, you know, safer trade routes to more effectively communicate things. Eventually you start laying down, you know, telegraph lines, and then telephones and radio and television, and it's constantly sort of improving the ability to get information out to people. But the printing press makes a huge, huge difference, because it does, as Tom says, I mean, it takes an incredible amount of time to sit there and transcribe, especially if you're going to paint nice little pictures in the margins. You know, the Bible, it takes forever. This is stuff that, like, fascist teachers do to students these days, you know? You talked in my class, you're going to sit here and you're going to copy 5 pages out of the dictionary. And it's horrible, you know, because you sit there and you write and you write and you write and you write, and you feel like you're getting nowhere, you know. And now all of a sudden you can run off pages, you know, you set everything up, and then you can run off 100 pages very quickly, and then create these little treatises. And the one person who really, like, in my opinion, totally makes the best use of the printing press early on is Martin Luther. Because this guy pops out like pamphlet after pamphlet after pamphlet after pamphlet after pamphlet, ranting on about literally anything and everything he can think of for a while. And they're very short.
He's like the first blogger. Would that be?
You know, he's not far from the first blogger. Yeah, I mean, it was, and you know, it's not the Martin Luther that we traditionally teach about, but boy, you go back and you read some of these pamphlets that the guy wrote, and see vulgar side to him that just doesn't come out, you know, necessarily in the 95 Theses, you know. And we like to sort of think of him as this big sort of, like, you know, huge Protestant reformer, which he was, but he also, yeah, he had a colorful side to him as well. So if you want a good laugh, you know, go back and look at some of Martin Luther's pamphlets, if you can find them. Pretty easy to find, actually. Not the original ones, obviously. Okay, let's see what we got here. We got questions popping up. How did the fall of Constantinople to the Ottoman Turks lead to changes in trade, society, and diplomacy after 1453? And to follow on that, Cody Fenimore says, Tom, I miss you.
Oh, hey, Cody. Yes, Cody. I will be back soon. We're just moving, or we're getting the school year started. And then what's happened here is we a tree fell on our roof a couple months ago, and my daughter's actually been sleeping in the room where I've got my studio here. She's been sleeping on this couch here, so it's kind of limited my ability to produce new content. But hopefully that's going to be about done. I've been trying to put some more work into my website and some other stuff in the meantime. So yes, Cody, I will be back soon. And yeah, don't worry. And Paul, thanks for speaking to my daughter. She's probably gonna be coming to bed in a little bit. So hopefully Paul will get together and do something again in the near future. And I'll see y'all soon.
All right. Hey, thanks for stopping by, Tom.
All right. Thanks for having me, Paul.
Good to see you. Yeah, Tom Ritchie. If you haven't checked out his YouTube channel, please do so. He has got a ton of videos, and he really knows what he's talking about. He goes very, very in depth into things, and really has a good understanding of everything that the College Board's looking for. So I highly recommend his stuff. So to get back to the questions, the fall of Constantinople to the Ottoman Turks. So in 1453, the Ottoman Turks are actually able to breach the walls of Constantinople, and the Eastern Roman Empire finally falls, sort of the remnants of the old Roman Empire. And it has a few effects. Number one, the Ottoman Turks can, now that they've conquered like this main city and, this opening from the Black Sea into the Mediterranean, they're able to then branch out into the Mediterranean, and they totally take over the entire thing, which cuts off pretty much all trade that the Venetians and the Genoans and these other Italian city-states had been engaged in. It was all Mediterranean trade. They were getting things off like the Silk Road that came through, they came across Asia, and then they were bringing it into Europe. Well, now they can't do that because the Turks have taken all of this over. And so what it leads to is it leads to people to start to look to other avenues to get to what they need. And the Portuguese start looking down the coast of Africa, trying to find a way over to the Spice Islands. They eventually round Africa and go off, and they start establishing sea routes to the Spice Islands. And then, of course, very famously, Spain and Ferdinand and Isabella finance Columbus's idea to go and head off to the Indies, where the spices are, going the other way around the earth. And so it opens up the entire Atlantic trade. And it's all driven because the Ottoman Turks have taken over the Mediterranean and driven up prices like ridiculously through that. Mabel's asking, what are some of the social, political, and economic changes during the Renaissance that proves that it was the transition from the medieval to the modern world? Well, I would say, if we were to look at it, first of all, it's a transition away from a Christian dominated society. Not that these people weren't Christian, but in the Middle Ages, the idea of nations it didn't exist. Like, there was a unified church. There was Christendom, right? And people who lived in Christendom were subjects of, the church. And that was sort of the unifying everything of the Middle Ages. As we get into the Renaissance, secular ideas and civic humanist ideas start to challenge the church in some ways, but they also start to emphasize the importance of societies, the importance of city-states in Italy, the importance of nation-states in Western Europe, and the establishment of those societies. And when those start to arise, question the authority of the church, that's where many, many scholars start to say this is where we start to see modern Europe. Now, interestingly enough, if you really read your textbook, you're going to see that phrase probably 20 times, like, and this is the beginning of modern Europe. So then they start using early modern and all of that. But those are the types of things which change during the Renaissance, which really make kind of a difference as we go along. Josh wants to know, how did the signing of the document of the Peace of Lodi in Italy helped preserve these smaller Harambe city-states in the memedom. No idea what the last part means. Anyway, the Treaty of Lodi was sort of an agreement that there would be a balance of power, which is going to be a theme throughout this course, the idea of a European balance of power. That if you have, I mean, you know, you can almost go Cold War on this. This is totally a continuation, but there are lots of examples in between. If you have two opposing sides that are groups of states or cities or whatever, and their power is enough to prevent the other side from taking them over, then you have a balance. And that's all fine and good. You know, in Italy, of course, the balance of power falls out because what happens is that with the inability to win in a balanced power situation, Italian city-states start calling in on these new nation states, and they call in France and Spain. And France and Spain then fight for control of Italy in Italy. And it sort of leads to sort of the downfall of the Italian Renaissance, because they're just being overrun by French and Spanish armies, and they'll be controlled by them for a very long time. The Austrians will jump in there for a long time as well. So those are some of the changes that go. That's some of what goes on with the Treaty of Lodi. And let's see. Can you please answer specifically? I'm not sure exactly what you mean by that. So anyway, the Renaissance, guys, if we want to kind of sum it up, this is a time where people start to look at ancient Greek and Roman texts. They start to look at ancient Greek and Roman ideas. They start to use those to put a new perspective on their society, a perspective which is no longer, which is not completely, I should, you know, make that a little clear, which is not completely sort of geared towards gaining salvation and admittance into heaven, but it's also about improving one's life on earth and improving one's society around them. And sometimes this involves using non-religious means to get things done. Great example of that is Machiavelli. You know, what he's writing about is not Christian, you know, if you get slapped in the face, turn the other cheek. This is totally, you know, a very secular approach to government of, you know, sometimes you have to be cruel to people in order to keep them in line. Sometimes you have to kill people who are justifiably deserving of death. And, you know, you need people to fear you if you want to maintain control of the society. So it's that transition, and the humanist ideals that cause that transition are going to push into different areas of political science. They're going to push into challenging the church. They're going to push into the arts. They're going to push into all of these different areas. So that's about as much as I have for you on a Tuesday night here. We've been going for a little over an hour here. If you caught sort of the end of this discussion, you're certainly welcome to watch this back and catch the stuff that we talked about earlier. And I just want to thank all of you who came on and viewed, and I want to thank all of you who asked questions. And I hope that I was able to make things a little bit clearer. If you look on my YouTube channel, you'll see that I have a number of videos that I've been creating to try and explain lots of things about European history for you. And I'll continue to be doing that throughout the year, so that will expand as we go along. But you know, this is all this is all for you guys, because, you know, I just kind of want to help. I want you guys to be able to understand this stuff better. And if you understand it when I explain it, more power to you. So anyway, thank you guys for tuning in. Have yourselves a wonderful Tuesday night. And don't forget, we've got a Labor Day weekend coming up. And yeah, you can all grill out burgers and think about how great it is that labor unions were able to get all of the things that they got, which you'll learn about somewhere around maybe March, maybe February. Anyway, good night. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe to my channel. Please subscribe. And then you can be notified whenever I post new videos. I think I'm going to be doing these on a more regular basis, so keep your eyes out for more live review sessions as the year goes on. So have a great night, and thanks for watching.